Hi, everybody. I hope everybody's doing okay and kind of still paying attention to the things that are really helpful. Staying 6 to 8 feet away from everybody, washing your hands as often as possible, and being as safe as you possibly can. There's all kinds of information out there where that won't last very much longer and all the rest of it, but I don't necessarily agree with that. We're right in the midst of looking after ourselves, and it's important to continue to do so. I have a few questions here, and um, the first one is related. Is from Natalie, and Jennifer has um, a very similar question, in relatively so, and it's about. Maybe I'll try and read the question and see if we can um, give an answer with it. Can you talk tomorrow night about how hard it is to take in a feeling of being loved? Uh, can understand why that's the case if you've experienced love as something that has to be earned and gets taken away when you don't do things right. She's talking about a talk that we had about this idea of loving in terms of training that you've had during a, quite a normal period of upbringing. Normal period meaning from the age of 0 to 18, 20, whenever you begin to leave home, if that's the particular case. And how that sticks with you, and how we believe everything that we have learned is important, yet we don't consciously notice that it's important. It's just that we replicate these things, and we are affected by how things have been in relationship to the family home. Also, by the way, not only the family home, but our culture. We watch a lot of TV. We are affected by, in the old days, you were affected by movies, how love should be and how it shouldn't be, and oh, so much that we take in that we don't really think about, but we unconsciously engage with at all kinds of interactive times during our lifetime. And we don't even notice we're doing that because our conscious awareness isn't as much as we believe it is. But we're learning about that, right? So then she says that builds up a barrier to feeling it because you can't trust it. In other words, if you have a sense that you're not trustworthy, then you will not trust that others are trustworthy. And of course, they're brought up in their relative situations, and therefore they are doing exactly the same thing as any one of us are that are human beings. And they are engaging in a way that they believe engagement should be based on how they were trained and how they make sense of things. It's a bit like a puffy little cloud around us, and that cloud is formed by habit and an experience that is consistently reconstructing the same cloud. Nothing negative about that. We often call that cloud around us and how it functions personality. It's very physical. It's also emotional. It's reflexive, and it's also and takes in a level of how we think as well. We often also, as Natalie is implying, have defensive modalities that protect that cloud. And she says, how can you feel it when someone tries to tell you or show you that they love you? In other words, she's talking about trust here, right? You're constructed, for example, Unknown to your parental background, on top of this, is a transmission of energy that relates to their unconscious reflexive training that comes from their parental background. And then your parents say, well, no, I'm going to try and bring somebody up this way versus that way. And they end up doing some reflexive responses, which include being upset about their parental background. And so upsetness or not trusting or intensity, and also belief that you're doing the exact right thing, is all involved with the whole process of loving. Your form of loving, one could say, is the only form that is truly right. Right for you, and then reflexively, unknown to you, you act out these responses. It's complicated because we are complex beings with a very little bit of awareness, but lots of potential to be aware, but little awareness of how we function, but a lot of defense around functioning in the appropriate way. Our version, of course, and therefore other people's versions are not functional in a way that would be exactly correct. Often all kinds of problems are involved with relationships, specifically because individuals were not trained perfectly, exactly the same way. But there are some aligning characteristics. Seldom do we search for those to understand why we engage with the person, but it's a natural thing to have aligning relationships. You might like something about the person that you're engaged with because it is in alignment with the differences that you want to be involved with as a person, not being like your parental background, but ending up being like your parental background. It's a complex thing, and it's uncomfortable. Now, Jennifer says, yeah, but I can look in the eyes of a dog and I can feel really comfortable and loving towards that dog. And that dog is looking at me like it loves me unconditionally until the next person walks into the room, of course. That part she didn't have down. And the dog would look at that person, if it liked that person, but in anticipation of something. Either you being the master and giving them food, or you giving them a kind of loving that you can't give to human beings because it wouldn't be rational to give it to human beings the same way the dog is giving it to you. That would be all-encompassing, opening, so wonderful. Well, here's another thing. I know I'm smiling because, we're all human beings and we have these ways of seeing these things and these ways of blanking that stuff out so we don't see it about ourselves. We watch other people doing it and we can see a little bit of that in them. We can see their distrust. We can see why they're not trustworthy. We can see that they should be like this instead of like that. And that would mean, implied, of course, that you would love them more. In fact, you wouldn't love them any better. You'd find something fault with that. But why would that be negative? It's not. It's not negative. It's reflexive training, energetic transmission that has exactly the internal structure of how a person functions in relationship to how you were trained. They are training you energetically. Yes, of course. Also verbally, personality-wise. No negativity is attached to this. This is how it works for us. We're human beings. We tend to do these things. Unfortunately, in some cases, it's very difficult. And in other cases, well, it's hard for us to see our relationship with ourselves. But we're learning how to become consciously aware, little tiny bit by little tiny bit. I've often heard people say, I no longer am like this. I now have changed and am like that. No, you haven't. You have to some degree. You also have what you were before in you. That does not negate you. How you were before doesn't negate you either. But you, in your capability to become aware, have noticed you have a preference against being the way you were, and you tend to have a critical aspect in there. But you never saw it before because you had a reason for being that way that was profoundly helpful to you in either an image that you were supporting as an individual or in a situation, a context that you believed how you were acting really was justified under those circumstances. You were helping somebody, or you were afraid of somebody, and therefore you acted in a certain way, even perhaps before they acted that way, because you wanted to get your stuff in first. It's possible. We live in those realms of relative need to protect our vulnerability before it's even attacked sometimes. And sometimes it is attacked. Our whole system of training culturally in many, many different cultures is to engage in a manner that is self-protective, even if there's nothing to be protected from. Our assumptions are that there is always something to be protected from. These are strong incentives not to open yourself to loving on the outside or on the inside, because if you do, you will be hurt. And hurting then is aligned with loving, not real. Yes, it can be real. If you hurt because you are loving, it's because you're sensitive and have a capability of loving beyond what you can understand. So you attempt to protect before that can occur. Dogs don't do that. Although some dogs have been trained to be aggressive, and they're not trained to be loving. If you love a dog and it's not trained to be aggressive, hasn't been brought up that way, they will love you for the moment. And they may even remember, and some dogs are very capable in this, that you have loved them. Even if they disappear for a while and they come back, they will see you and know you immediately. Well, there's another level of loving for a human being. Now, look, I want to mention before I go there, one very, very important thing from my perspective. For those of you who know people who don't seem to love, what you don't understand is they are loving themselves. They're in a situation where their need is great to protect themselves, to love themselves in a way that they don't even understand they're doing, so that it won't be hurting. Those folks have the potential of loving externally as well as internally, reflexively and consciously, as we all do, every one of us. But we're talking about energetic terms here as well. And this is really complicated. Energy comes in to your system, from my point of view, of course, through these chakra systems or valves. that are regulated by consistencies or inconsistencies or just normalizations of how you use energy to engage with life. How you use energy to engage with life. Your personalizations, how you function. Nobody is perfectly able to function, even if you think you are. There are many ways to function, many image ideals, many images that aren't very ideal. But even in those cases, if that's your image, you will function like that. You'll construct a system to function in the way you believe you think you need to. You'll get your cues from other people. Our cues in our world are often power-based. They're not love-based. Now, I've said that 100 times, but I could be wrong. Here's the reason why. If you have a power-based system, you are basically in love with the system. You, as a system, you a form, a living form, energetic in nature, personality oriented on the outside, looking in from others' point of view, but you on the inside, still looking at your personality as vitalized and important the way you do it. But if you could conceive of the concept of deepening your relationship with awareness, you could perceive the energy inside. And then as you begin to do that more, you slowly start to perceive through an internal mental, emotional, physical lens. And what do I mean by that? It's as if suddenly you're noticing things you never saw before. Unfortunately, you're trained to be critical under those conditions, perhaps. And then when you start to see things you never saw before, you have to learn how to soften down the criticism that comes automatically from that cloud around you that you believe is vital to survive. Don't hear any negativity there. But I do hear shutters of closing down an engagement with compassion for another, knowing and caring about them in a way that they don't understand and you don't understand always, but you're caring for them because you know they're learning through them and they do not know them or understand them, but they have to act out to defend themselves. That's love in a way. Yes, it's self-important, but who else in our world is going to protect you if you don't attempt to protect yourself? This is the line of reference that we hold near and dear, not to our hearts, to our emotional, physical, mental construct we call our form, our physical form, our personality. To prove that, just listen to people talk, even me sometimes, if I might say that you're critical or you're defending yourself. What do? Your defenses come up to defend you. This is normal. And this form is natural in our world. Saying that you never do this is just not real. But it may be that your image of you doesn't see you do that. It only sees only the things that you do well from your perspective, not from anybody else's, from yours. And you might even try to sell this idea to others. And unfortunately, others might even agree with you. But how about if you could see it and slowly soften it down? And try to understand you differently than what you believe you're like. That makes you vulnerable. It means you slowly are adding moments into your personality life where you are not necessarily agreeing with how you function. By the way, this is the entry point of sages for thousands of years in every belief system that they would hole up in a cave or someplace in the forest, jungles. But they had another aim. They replaced the aim of their relationship with their own self-interest, of course, still part of their self-interest in a way, with attaining a level of higher state engagement. They would call it God. They would call it Babaji. They would call it any name that was meaningful to themselves. Meaning, wherever they came from, whatever belief they had, they would use for the purpose of attaining a level or a state beyond where they were. They began to be in love with a state beyond where they were, not the state that they were in. Yet, their automatic system would help them to protect the state they were in. They would have food, release toxins out of their body, elimination structures, try to meditate, use prayer or concentration of a particular kind on a mantra, which is basically a prayer, repeated over and over again. And they would do this because they believed that there was a deeper level of engagement with energy than what they had constructed by the use of energy, same energy, for a purpose that was useful here on this planet to survive. They weren't negating anybody. Well, maybe some were. They weren't negating anything. They were in a movement towards their so-called potential. In the attainment of that potential, they did nothing. There were no TV programs. They didn't want a whole lot of people knowing. They were engaging with that flow internal and realizing that there was a different state that they could attain by the focus that they had on love. They tried to love themselves, truly loving as if by caring for themselves, not unconsciously, consciously, and caring for those higher states. And eventually they realized that the only release they had was to engage with higher states for the purpose of helping others engage with higher states. Now, they did it in a different way than most teachers do in our world. They did it by transmission. They would hold the world in their mind, but only after they had reached a state of higher consciousness. They did not believe that they could trust themselves. If you can listen to this one, when they were in the personality state of thinking they were important, they knew they couldn't help the world in those places unless there was a second, a moment, one little tiny second of emptiness of themselves and their defenses. And in that moment, they could engage with the world. because the flow of energy moving through them would increase in those chakras to the point where they could be comfortable thinking of nothing. There was a silence. They were not thinking of themselves. They're not interested in the name or the images that they gave them. Not interested in being called Swami this or Yogi that, or lecturer this, or important teacher this and that, or competing with anybody. They had no relevance whatsoever. There's no competition in those states. There's loving in those states. It is a tangible sensation of loving with no rules attached. This is where we run into trouble, and this is part of Natalie and Jennifer's question, and others. I think Jeannie's question, too, was related to it. Irving. And it becomes a conscious thing, and they were conscious of it. They did not want anyone to interrupt it. Of course, that's a personality trait as well. And they knew this to be true. They would realize that they just interfered with that empty space that was broadening from 1 second into minutes, into hours, into days, into weeks, into months. They never lost their ability to protect themselves. If an individual was yelling outside about wanting to be a student of theirs, they would ignore them to the best of their ability and perhaps maybe get annoyed. As soon as they were annoyed, they knew that this was not an act of love. This is a deeper level of loving, a broader level of loving. There are many levels of loving. Being honorable and engaging with a belief is a level of loving. Understanding in some weird way how life is a level of loving. It's a level of loving of an idea. Every single day of our lives, we are practicing loving. If we see a certain way of acting works in the world and we use it, and people think we're great because we use this particular way of living in the world, it's a level of loving. If you fall in love with that method and you're the one who does it, you are loving that. And one day, you may not necessarily agree with that style and realize that there is something beyond that style. There is something beyond the self-protection that we set up in front of caring and loving for people. Since everyone on the planet, not quite, there are some who are really capable of engaging with a flow of love that is unbelievable. This is not according to their personality's view. It is engagement with the act of beingness that flushes and flows at a very deep level and is soft, softer than you can ever imagine, rather than powerful, loving person. Blah, blah. That's not negative, just part of how we define loving. It would be an interesting exercise for all of us to consider the rules and regulations that we have around the concepts of loving other people. And also engage with and see what loving is for you and try to recognize that that's part of it, but not exactly all of it. And there's much more. That love that a dog might have, yeah, it's skewed, maybe. But I remember Donna Volness, where she lived in Granville, had a wonderful husky. I'll call it a husky. I've forgotten the name of that kind of husky. Only stood about a foot and a half, maybe off the ground. But it had a heart center. It's an animal. It has a heart center on. Every time I went there, my heart center went on. And when I approached that dog, both our hearts were pounding with that flow of energy moving through our chests. That dog was not a normal, in my remembrances of dogs. Can't say I've met every dog in the world. It was not quite normal, but it was a dog that had the capability of perceiving, even though it may have been quite physical, quite emotional.